It's the Wonkhe Show. A third of the public now reckon a degree just isn't worth the time or money. So, how worried should we be about that? England's missing middle at levels 4 and 5 is back on the agenda, but is anyone actually going to do anything about it this time? And our expert guests tell us what else we need to know about the week in higher education. It's all coming up.
So, the big irony for government, and I'm sure the big frustration, is that, actually what they really want to do is find ways to kind of intervene and direct things. But inevitably, with things like the Strategic Priorities Grant, they're finding themselves in a place where they're having to cut back on those levers rather than kind of expand them.
Welcome back to the Wonkhe Show, your weekly into this week's higher education news, policy and analysis. I'm your host, Mark Leach, and here to chew the fat over this week's news. As usual, we've got three brilliant guests. Somewhere between Manchester and the West Midlands, it's Andy Westwood, fellow of the Post-18 Project and member of the Skills England Board. Andy, your highlight of the week, please.
Well, morning, Mark. My highlight of the week, I started this week, I was in Copenhagen. So on Monday, I was walking around the Danish Parliament reenacting scenes from Borgen. That's quite hard to beat.
In Camberwell, it's Eve Alcock, Executive Director for External Affairs at QAA. Eve, your highlight of the week, please.
My highlight of the week was on Monday. I had the pleasure of visiting Liverpool John Moores University, meeting with some of their senior leaders and senior academic staff, and it was just a joy to be out in the sector, on campus, in sort of 3D real life.
Very good. And in Oxford, it's Michael Salmon, Wonkhe's news editor. Michael, your highlight of the week, please.
Well, it's got to be launching our Party Conferences app. We've set up this nice bit of digital kit that anybody in the sector can use if you're making the trip to Liverpool or elsewhere for party conference season this autumn. We think it should be really useful, and you can see it at partyconferences.wonkhe.com.
Yes. Please do. Everyone get involved with that. Right. We start the week with public opinion. Michael, what's going on?
Yeah, it's been another one of those weeks with lots in the press about university not being worth it anymore, at least in sort of the public's mind eye, with a nice side helping of the English student finance system being a nightmare. So, the big sort of headline driving event has been the release of a new chapter of the British Social Attitudes Survey, sometimes called the BSA. This is a really sort of prestigious and well-respected regular piece of research from the National Centre for Social Research. They've done it for many, many years, asking the public the same questions, going quite in depth. And they released a chapter specifically looking at what people think sort of now, or at least in 2025, about university and higher education and how that's changed over time. And, there's various things, so there's been some quite big shifts, and there's also been things that have stayed quite similar. But the thing that's driven quite a lot of the newspaper coverage has been the finding that only a third of the public currently, that now a third of the British public thinks that university education just isn't worth the time and money it usually takes. That's a quote. So a third of people agreed with that. And that is one of the answers that's really increased quite a bit. It was 14% in 2005 and 18% as recently as 2018. So that's, there's been a real spike in that in sort of 6-7 years. There's other questions on things like fees, on the public's perceptions of whether university pays off financially. There's a new question on international students. So yeah, it's been covered quite widely in the press, and it's all come alongside this House of Commons Treasury Committee inquiry into student loans, which had its first hearing this week. And, it's been another occasion for lots of people to say that the student finance system is terrible, that graduates have sort of been missold loans, or at least have this kind of, debt burden hanging around their shoulders for the rest of their working lives. Yeah, so another one of those, weeks in the sort of tough dealings in the court of public opinion for the HE sector.
Yeah, looks bad. Andy, but you spent a career in the political economy of this kind of stuff. Help us out. Is this a genuine collapse in the perceived value of a degree, or is it something else? Is it about the offer, the higher fees, the maintenance package, and all the noise and the press and everything that's led us to this moment?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't call it a collapse. It's a pretty big shift, but I think anyone who's surprised by it hasn't really been paying attention over the last decade. All of those things you've just mentioned are driving this. You've got, like you say, all the kind of relatively more recent noise, although it's been going on over a decade, around kind of reforms to Plan 2 and Plan 5, particularly in England. We've seen obviously the cost of living of being a student kind of grow and grow and grow as it has for the rest of the population. So going to university is becoming more expensive. There's no way of avoiding that. And of course, over the last decade, we've seen very little economic growth. We've seen, as a kind of consequence of that, a falling graduate premium in most subjects in most parts of the country. And, we're inevitably seeing a kind of much tougher labour market for graduates. And if that wasn't enough, we've had a decade or more of pretty intense culture wars, where the value of higher education and universities in particular has been attacked from different parts of the political spectrum. So, inevitably, I guess, the public are kind of receiving all of those messages and translating it into a kind of, harder questions for the sector about its value, and specifically about the value of going to university and getting a degree.
Yeah, I totally agree with Andy. The perception and the perception shift feels to me to be a symptom of a bunch of factors, and Andy's, run through them. For me, the overriding sense I get is that perceptions about the value of HE and degrees get worse when the stakes are higher. And I don't think the stakes have ever been higher for students, both in terms of the kind of financial cost to sustain themselves whilst they're studying, the debt that they graduate with, the kind of labour market state as it is. But what was interesting when I looked at some of the detail of this as well is that shift has not been seen in the question about whether there are too many graduates, and thinking about sort of like size of the sector. And so there's some interesting nuance kind of below the surface. I think the other thing that struck me, and I was reflecting on, I suppose, my own time at university, is that for me, so I graduated in 2018, did a couple of years as a SAB, but for me, my perception of the value of my higher education experience and my degree has increased over the time that I've been in work, because I can see now much more clearly how what I did at university has made a clear bearing on my career path and kind of where I am now, and that it's much harder to assess that value the kind of more recent a graduate you are, I think. And so that's the other kind of reflection or layer of nuance I would put over some of these, where there's a bit of breakdown by kind of age in some of the stuff, but it's slightly more nuanced than that, I think.
Michael, one of the striking findings is this swing among Conservative voters, isn't it? They asking for fewer HE opportunities. What do you think that does to politics in the sector as we lead to thinking about another general election on the horizon?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the reasons the BSA survey is very useful, is because you can sort of see how different party groups have sort of changed. I mean, with the caveat that, the politics has changed a lot, right, too. So, I mean, I saw there was one thing where you see that, the Lib Dem voters seem to have become more in favour of, expanding opportunity. And then you think, well, in 2017, who were the Lib Dems? They were very, were they even around in 2017? They're sort of nadir, right? The voter shift, the Conservative Party, and the Conservative voters now is a much more sort of select crew than it used to be. But I do think that is, more widely a very important trend for the sector to be thinking about. We had 14 years of the Conservatives in power, and while they did do some of the kind of culture warring that Andy's mentioned, they did sort of, stoke some of the skepticism about HE. They didn't really make any policy moves that in the end, they various things were announced and sort of, but nothing huge changed, especially sort of towards the end of their term. Whereas now that they're in opposition, and similarly to reform, both are very openly talking about, if we come back to power, we are going to be, shrinking at least the part of the sector that's based on sort of, undergraduate student finance. And, that's something that as the next general election approaches is going to come quite sharply into focus in a lot of people's minds, I think. What
and international students, right? They people want limits on international students, so that's coming through really clearly.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's quite interesting about Conservative and Reform voters, of course, is that they tend to be older. So, their personal experience of kind of higher education is much likely to be less than kind of younger voters. And that sort of shows up in the polls, and it shows up in kind of voting behaviours. And particularly if you move across to kind of Reform, then the profile very closely associated with those that voted to leave in the EU referendum, then there's also a kind of qualification sort of level to that. So, there are various things kind of driving the particular kind of view of higher education on the kind of right of the political spectrum that we should sort of bear in mind. And and those views are also driving that kind of that much harder sort of attitude towards immigration generally, but immigration in the kind of particular area of international student recruitment and kind of, and the extent to which international students stay on and work after their studies. So, none of that is surprising. I think the hard thing for universities and students is kind of how do you tackle that? How do you tackle that? Not just the disaffection that the BSA or that sort of kind of suspicion, if you like, that the BSA sort of points to, but how do you tackle those really entrenched views in those particular parts of the political spectrum that on the whole we are less used to having conversations with? And that goes with kind of local areas as well as particular kind of types of voter or political party supporters.
Yeah. Eve, how, and you're not allowed to say tell better stories because that just does not wash anymore. How do we tackle this?
This might sound really bleak, but I think it's going to be extremely difficult to do that whilst the economy is as bad as it is. I think, and you're right, like telling better stories doesn't work. We can talk all we like about, trying to make more of the kind of civic role, local community, like all of that kind of stuff. But it just feels to me like the perceptions are so entrenched, but are symptomatic of people just feeling like their lives are crap and not really getting any better. That feeling is being projected at universities. And I don't have any solutions. I also love sitting in sector conversations about all of this, but I've never ever come away from one of those conversations about this kind of thing with a sense that what has been discussed is A, deliverable, and B, is going to make a difference. And I know that's a really bleak thing to say, but I think that whilst the economy is as bad as it is, it's sort of nigh on impossible in the short term, like to make any meaningful difference ahead of a kind of the next election to shift these entrenched views.
I think you're absolutely right, Eve, and it's I think there's also such a kind of place dimension to this, and the BSA doesn't really unpack this, but we know that kind of if you look at voting patterns, that particular types of places are not only struggling economically, they're much more sort of likely not just to kind of demonstrate some of the attitudes we're talking about, but they're also much less likely to have any direct experience of a university on their patch or doing anything or telling good stories in their area. So, if you pick a kind of a good example of that at the moment and sort of trot over to Makerfield and walk up and down the high street there, but there are plenty of places not very far away from, any of the universities where we might visit or kind of work. You can kind of see and feel all of those issues in a very different way. So I think the first step, if you like, is getting out of those rooms where all of us in the sector kind of wring our hands, and I've been in all of those rooms too. And go to the places and try and understand kind of, how it feels for people in those particular places and kind of, what their lives are like, what their jobs are like, if they can get one, what their kind of experience of public services is, what their life chances are, what the life chances of their kids are. And just being present in those places, I think kind of not just gives them an understanding of us, it gives us an understanding of them.
I think the other thing that will be interesting on this is what happens when the more invisible benefits to some of those communities of having a university nearby become visible through university closing down. and the economic impact that that would have in that place. And it feels to me that if that was to happen, it would serve as a clearer example of like, you don't know what you've got till it's gone, if that makes sense. But, it's a sad state of affairs that something as extreme as that might be the only way to shift some people's perceptions of, oh, I hadn't quite realised how much that provider was contributing to our local economy or employing local people or whatever it might be. So yeah, it will be interesting to see if that happens over the next couple of years, how that plays out in whether it shifts people's perceptions.
Yeah, so all of this is against the backdrop, Michael, isn't it, of this House of Commons Treasury Committee on student loans and the tensions all on Plan 2 loans, etc., etc. What's going on?
Yeah, so this is, I think what looks to be now is going to be quite a quick inquiry. We had the sort of first session this week with sort of Universities UK, NUS, some of the campaign groups like Rethink Repayment. Next week, we've got the ministers. They did a big publication about a fortnight ago of all the sort of volumes and volumes of submissions they had from sort of graduates who are unhappy about their repayment terms and growing repayment balances. Yeah, I think the committee will make some recommendations. The government at some point will need to respond to those. I think the real risk with this one is that it really becomes focused on Plan 2, which, in England is not a system that current students are on. It's the one that, used to be in place for about a decade, but has sort of higher interest rates, but things like, shorter repayment terms, for example, and that what could end up happening is that the sort of, fairly well-off graduates who are earning a lot at the moment, they're in their 30s now, they're wanting to buy a house, they're in, they're unhappy with how much they're repaying. And if they're able to sort of shout loudest, then they're able to sort of force the government's attention onto the old system, avoid having time, capacity, or money to do things about sort of, the sector's current challenges and the current student finance system. Yeah, we'll have to see, but that's sort of my hunch for where that's going, based on sort of what's being said by the committee and just how much some of these groups like Rethink Repayment are how much press coverage they're managing to generate.
That's been lacking. I also think one of the reasons that this scheme is flawed is it's so complicated that when the Treasury reaches in to take £5 billion from the repayment scheme to spend on something else over there, nobody notices.
Yeah.
Wonkhe, our little higher education blog home, will kind of hop up and down, and the rest of the world carries on as though nothing's happened, and that's not right. We need more transparency.
Yeah, the thing for me with this, so I'm on a Plan 2 student loan, and it is exceedingly painful when you log into your student loan account. And so I firmly believe that it needs a rethink. I just can't understand where government are going to find the money to make any meaningful change effectively. We've seen in recent HE policy making, with maintenance grants, that they're doing that in order to pay for that's coming from the international student levy. And so I just worry about if I suppose the political kind of drive is so clear on this that government have to do something, what sort of consequence we're going to see in terms of robbing Peter to pay Paul, I guess.
That's a really good point, isn't it? I think it, we saw the sort of a little kind of glimpse into that. Yeah, so we can trace this back to Rachel Reeves kind of deciding not to increase national insurance or income tax back in the budget a year or so ago, and instead going for this kind of smorgasbord of small rises, of which that freeze to the repayment threshold was one, which really was the kind of, the straw that broke the camel's back on Plan 2. But like you say, I mean, the irony of all of this is that if government are going to react, they're almost certainly going to have to find somewhere else to take the money from. And, and all of this sort of underplays the fact that kind of in a few years' time, the committee may as well put in their diary an inquiry into Plan 5. Because if you think Plan 2's bad, wait till you see people graduating and kind of, trying to deal with that in 5 to 10 years' time.
Yeah, and I think just on the topic of, money coming out of the system in other places, I think the other thing that was sort of important for people to be aware of from the hearing this week was that Universities UK Chief Exec Vivian Stern was there, And she essentially confirmed what we, were suggesting a couple of weeks ago on Wonkhe, which is that the strategic priorities grant, this sort of, direct government funding for the cost of teaching and supporting students in HE, is about to be cut again for the second year in a row. I mean, she said, there's a letter sitting on all ready to be sent to the Office for Students, and that's going to come quite soon. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about that next week. But that's another clear example of where the government just doesn't have the money to do big things in one part of the system, the HE system, without sort of clawing it back elsewhere.
And the slightly odd thing about that, both the strategic priorities grant and this sort of retreat from public support for higher education, kind of more broadly, is that this is also a government that wants to prioritise particular subjects, particular qualifications, particular sectors and places in the economy. So it's kind of aching for levers that direct provision and direct student choice and kind of, put things towards the bits of the economy that they think are going to be the things that actually get us out of this doom loop, the things that are going to drive growth in the economy more broadly. So, the big irony for government, and I'm sure the big frustration, is that, actually what they really want to do is find ways to kind of intervene and direct things. But inevitably, with things like the Strategic Priorities Grant, they're finding themselves in a place where they're having to cut back on those levers rather than kind of expand them. Of course, this is a slightly different conversation if we're talking about the research budget, where there is resource and you can apply it in a more direct kind of a way in support of those priorities. But in the kind of funding of teaching and undergraduate support in kind of the higher education system, it doesn't feel that way at all.
Right, let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Hi, I'm Brendan Coulson, and this week on Wonkhe, I'll be discussing how the LLE could finally make accelerated degrees make sense. In the draft statutory instruments for the Lifelong Learning Fee Limits Regulations 2026, it confirms that the LLE's credit-based approach aligns fee limits much more closely to learning volume, meaning accelerated study is treated the same as other modes of study on a per-credit basis. In short, the LLE could give accelerated degrees another chance, this time with a funding system that actually matches the policy ambition. Thank you.
Right, there's been a new report for the Lifelong Education Institute. Eve, walk us through it, please.
Sure. So yes, we've got a new report from the LEI in partnership with Pearson. And they're sort of making the case for the fact that level 4-5 qualifications as kind of standalone are really crucial to economic growth and fulfilling skills shortages. The report outlines sort of 5 barriers which they say are leading to a lack of market demand for effectively kind of higher technical qualifications. That's everything from a kind of lack of signalling from employers that they value it, generally low kind of recognition and awareness, loan finance and the reliance on that being a challenge. That's a barrier, obviously, we've heard come up in the LLE debate. Problem with progression pathways being quite opaque and stuff around the kind of rigidity of qualification design. Amongst its recommendations, there's calls for stronger coherence really in some of the funding systems. So they recommend that basically LLE is integrated with the Growth and Skills Levy and devolved regional funding frameworks. And then they also, amongst a couple of other recommendations, talk about the introduction of formal degree breakpoints to normalise level 4 and 5 achievements within, I guess, broader 3-year degree structures. And that's quite interesting, I guess, because that has also cropped up before in the post-16 white paper, and DFE had promised to consult on it but hasn't got round to it yet. So yes, some interesting thoughts around what they call the missing middle and how to fill that for the benefit of economic growth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good and important report, and I should sort of make clear that, you know, as a board member of Skills England, that these are particular policy issues that we're charged with kind of thinking about. But long before Skills England was created, you know, this has been an area of concern for lots of different successive governments of different types. And the missing middle as a phrase, I remember kind of the Auger review kind of using it a lot. Simon Field of the OECD has used it a lot. And the reason why both of them kind of have used this particular kind of label is that it's true. And if you compare, England in particular, but the UK kind of more broadly, to other countries and systems, particularly in the OECD, then we are an outlier. We have a very small number of people doing these kind of level 4 or 5 upper technical qualifications. It's partly connected to the kind of, the system that we have at level 6, i.e. going back to the kind of discussion about undergraduate kind of policy and funding, and particularly kind of, the uncapped kind of system, and compared to technical education, kind of at least some student support. I wouldn't say generous student support, but it is compared to further education and upper technical education. So, in the kind of countries that do lots and lots of this stuff, which is pretty much every other country in the OECD, tend to do better in both regional policy, in industrial policy. They tend to do better in productivity, and they tend to have kind of, essentially better economic growth, which we've already been talking about. So, for that reason, lots of policymakers and politicians have kind of looked to our system and thought, well, how do we create that middle? How do we populate that middle here? And this report kind of gives us some understanding of kind of, why has our system evolved with the kind of barriers that Eve, you've just set out, and what can we do to fill it? And I think I think that is a live question. There are not just questions about what can you do to incentivize employers and individuals to kind of think about level 4, 5. You've also got to think about the bits of the system that surround it. Does the way we organize higher education disincentivize employers to invest in this space? Does it disincentivize individuals to kind of, think about doing a level 4, 5 before converting maybe to an honours degree? Does it disincentivize kind of, part-time people in work to kind of take these smaller steps towards kind of higher qualifications than kind of getting all your education done before you really get into the labour market in a meaningful way? And the reality, of course, is that's exactly what happens. We need to think about the kind of system as a whole, which, as you were saying earlier, Eve, the post-16 white paper does try and do that when it thinks about a much broader tertiary approach. The question is, how do you do that? And what are the kind of policy steps that you put in place to try and address all of those barriers and kind of build a system that we haven't really had in any meaningful kind of size for decades?
Yeah, because for me, what's interesting is, so obviously Cert HE and Dip HEs exist. They have existed for a long time. They are those level 4, 5 standalone. If you finish after your first year or your second year of a degree, you can come away with those exit awards. But culturally, they are seen as consolation prizes because you signed up for something that should have taken 3 years, and there's a sense that you only stuck it out for a year or 2 years. So there's this kind of cultural challenge there. And then also on courses that have PSRB regulation, for example, you can't give exit awards after the first year because of the way that those courses are structured, and the learning is kind of structured across those 3 years. So there are some barriers there. But also, to your point, Andy, about the kind of system, our regulatory system in England currently would consider sort of breakpoint as a bad outcome. That student hasn't continued on to the second year. It looks worse in the stats. And that, for me, has been running theme for the past sort of 18 months, particularly as well after the white paper in the autumn, where the laudable government vision for some of this stuff cannot happen in the system that we have it. But the government has no money to make the significant changes and bandwidth to make the significant changes to the system that would allow their vision to actually be realised.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, if you look particularly at the sort of the Cert Ed, as you rightly put it, the kind of consolation prize sort of breakpoint, that is, it isn't supported. It's kind of actively disincentivized. But then so too are, as the report mentions, kind of, the technical qualifications, like kind of, the HNCs, which are sort of, much more recognised as a kind of, an upper technical qualification in its own right, or had been traditionally, rather than kind of, something that you might award kind of after failing, in inverted commas, at first year or second year. And I guess what this all speaks to is just how dominant that 3-year honours degree is in our system, and it tends to displace not just kind kind of the way people understand the system and kind of what choices they make. But it just displaces thinking about what the alternatives might be from a policy perspective and how you put these things together. The other big problem we have in the UK is that we have a go at these things and we never stick to them. So we've had foundation degrees, we've had higher technical qualifications, we've had kind of all sorts of different apprenticeship approaches. And, it doesn't offer the stability that kind of the wider world can then understand and kind of act on that the sort of the much more well-known and established kind of, full-time 3-year degree, undergraduate degree does offer. So, so there is a lot of stuff to address here. But, government does have the levers to do it if it wants to. And if it feels, for example, that, that too many people are going down the 3-year full-time undergraduate route and more should go down an upper technical route, then, it has both the regulatory and the funding levers to pull. And it's a matter of kind of having the courage to do that if you think it's a problem.
Every one of us who works in higher education knows our own patch pretty well. Far few of us can hold the whole picture: funding, teaching, research, students, data, governance, people, strategy, all of it at once. That's the gap that Making Sense of Higher Education is built to close. It's a new programme from Wonkhe. 10 live online modules, 1 hour each, running from October to April, delivered by the team you already listened to on this podcast, plus special guests across the series. It's built for people new to the sector, for governors, for mid-career professionals, and for academic leaders who want something different. Early bird tickets are open now. There's 10% off until the 31st of July. Further discounts are available for Wonkhe subscriber organisations and large groups. You can find the full programme and book your place at wonkhe.com/events. Right, and for our final item today, we're talking about everything that's caught the eyes of Andy, Eve, and Michael that's been in the HE news. Michael, you go first. What's been on your desk?
Yeah, well, big thing this week for me has been the sort of finally coming into force and being openly published new rules from UKVI about student sponsorship. So this all goes back to the immigration white paper. And in fact, it even goes further back to under the Conservatives. I mean, I think sometimes people characterize this as a sort of Labour thing, but, really this is just a Home Office thing where they're making it tougher for sponsors to remain compliant with rules, around things like continuation and completing courses and things like that. There's not, this week, nothing actually new was announced. They just were published. They came into force. It sounds like the Home Office is doing a bit of press today, even though these were actually, released on Monday. There's we can see there's been some ministerial comments have been given to both The Sun and GB News this morning. So that sort of tells you something already about, how the government seeks to sort of play this kind of, clamping down on student visa misuse narrative still. I think that for me, the really interesting thing here is we get confirmation that at some point next summer, in around 12 months' time, there's going to be a day where the Home Office publishes a list of every single, university, college, private provider, private school in the country which has the right to sponsor international students with a color-coded, score next to them, essentially. They're going to be red, they're going to be amber, they're going to be green. It's going to be a day, it's going to be sort of like TEF, right? But we can call it VEF or something, It is like a new ranking. And when this happens, I do think there's a potential certainly for this to be a really massive deal, and large universities which get a red rating, I think can expect to see their names in the national press. I think there's all kinds of sort of deeper, more complicated impacts as well around things like access, relationships with banks and things where if you suddenly, being told that you're not a good student sponsor and you're on the Home Office's naughty step, there's some real serious consequences. And, and there are sort of some immediate levers there as well. like, having a mandatory drop in the number of international students you can recruit the next year if you get rated red. I mean, that will be existential potentially for some providers. So yeah, this will be sometime in the summer of 2027, and it already feels quite close. And I'm sure lots of universities are taking this very seriously.
Andy, what caught your eye?
Well, I was quite interested in DSIT and UKRI's announcement around local innovation partnership funding, which sounds very technical, but it still caught my eye, and basically rolled up in an announcement of a couple of projects that in Merseyside have kind of been awarded funds from kind of the current Local Innovation Partnership Fund, which is operated kind of centrally by UKRI. Wrapped up in that was a promise by Liz Kendall that this would be devolved after the next spending review to 6 or 7 mayors and combined authorities. So it's currently a pot of 500 million to go essentially to kind of local growth projects. So it's an example, if you like, of the sort of the UKRI bucket theory. And this is very much in the kind of government priority growth and sort of scale up buckets. And we'll see how much the Treasury and the spending review choose to allocate to this. But it's the first time, I think, where, at least since kind of RDAs, if anyone can remember them, had kind of regional innovation funding. It's the first time for a good while that some R&D cash is going to get determined and spent at the kind of local level, and in this case by mayors of strategic authorities working with universities over kind of local economic priorities.
And Eve, what caught your eye?
Catching my eye this week was the fact that OFS have opened an investigation into a sort of partnership provision between Oxford Brookes University and the Global Banking School. The investigation was opened in January, but has been sort of publicly announced that it has been opened this week. No idea on timelines for kind of completion of that. And we know that, in the past, sometimes these timelines go on longer than is probably ideal. But I'm particularly interested in it, I guess, because it's an investigation into sort of franchise provision with one of the bigger sort of teaching partners in this space, Global Banking School. So in 2022-23, Global Banking School was the 7th biggest full-time undergraduate teaching provider. And that's up from them being 103rd in size in 2019-20. So they've had a big kind of sharp growth in student numbers that are taught, that they teach, that have various other kind of awarding partners, Oxford Brookes obviously being one of them. And, QA has done some work quite recently in this space, confirming that link between the sharp growth and poorer outcomes and it being a risk to quality. So for me, it's particularly interesting because obviously the subcontracting partner is also on the OFS register. GBS is on the register. So it's similar to an investigation that we saw that has been opened between Bucks New and the London School of Science and Technology. I think that was at the back end of last year. Oh no, maybe May last year. And so I think it's going to be particularly interesting. I have a sort of morbid curiosity to see what comes out of that, because I think just the transparency of actually what is sort of happening on the ground in teaching partnerships there. They're looking at some B conditions and some E conditions, so kind of quality and management and governance. And I think there'll be, implications for what comes out of that for other universities who might also be in partnership with GBS if they find some problems there. So time will tell.
So that's about it for this week. Remember to go in deep on anything we discussed today or find links in the show notes on Wonkhe.com. Don't forget to subscribe. Just search for The Wonkhe Show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to get ahead of everything that's going on in UKHE, just click subscriptions on the site to find out more. So thanks very much to Andy, Eve, Michael, and also for Michael for making it all happen behind the scenes. We'll be back next week. Jim will be here. Until then, stay wonky.